The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we're going to be examining a really interesting question, Joel, and that is the dispersion of the Jewish population in the United States across the country. And to help us do that, we have three great guests that are involved in Jewish issues and Jewish populations outside of the New York area. We have Ira Sheskin, who is a professor of Judaic Studies at University of Miami and director of the Jewish Demography Project there. Mark Goldman, who is retired CEO of Gray Advertising in Atlanta and formerly head of marketing for the Atlanta Jewish Federation. And Tal Shmueli, who is the partner and CEO of Texas Venture Partners, an Israeli living in Austin. And gentlemen, welcome. Joel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I'd like to start off with, I've been following, and of course, Ira is the great expert here, this trend, which is that historically Jews viewed really the Northeast and California really as the, places that were most conducive for Jews to live in. That seems to be shifting a little bit more to the South. And so we'd like to explore why that's happening. So Ira is probably as good as anybody in terms of
the data.
Yeah. We're a bit data geeks. So what does the data tell us?
Okay, the data tell us exactly what you said, and I think it's true that Jews are like everybody else, only more so. And in this case, that seems to be the situation. If you went back to just after World War II, about 2/3 of American Jews lived in the Northeast. That is now down to about 40%. The percentage in the Midwest has been 12, 14%. Since World War II, that hasn't changed. But the percentage in the South has gone from about 10% up to 1 in 4 Jews living in the South. And in the West, it's gone from 10% up to 1 in 4 Jews living in the West. So there has been a major shift. Geographers would call that a shift from the snow belt to the sun belt. And that's exactly what has happened to the Jewish population. But it isn't, particularly in the South, it's not spread throughout the South. It's in particularly the state of Florida and Atlanta. If you go to places like Mississippi and Alabama, you really don't see any significant Jewish population.
Well, Mark, you're a perfect example of that. Somebody who's moved from New York. By the way, full disclosure, Mark and I have known each other for 50 years, used to work together back in the old days at Ogilvy and Mather Advertising. We became really close friends and have worked together on projects for 50 years. You moved from New York to Atlanta. What was your logic at that point?
Well, actually, we first moved to Knoxville. I had just tired of the ad business in New York City and got a pretty good offer to work for a company in Knoxville, Tennessee. And after 2 years, I was afforded an interesting opportunity in Atlanta, back in the advertising business, with 2 guys that had created a pretty good ad agency business for a new agency in Atlanta, which was just a kind of just a nascent ad business at that time. So 1990 is when we got here. And there were a lot of us that followed in 1990, late 1980s. And I think it's been growing ever since.
So it was economic opportunity. It wasn't necessarily. And how about you, Tal? You're coming in from Israel. What is it about Austin that has attracted?
And I think also in Texas, and the numbers I've seen, cities like Dallas, Houston, and now Austin seem to be increasing. So, Tal, one of the things I was really interested in when we spoke was, particularly if you're Israeli, that it's much easier to live in Texas than, let's say, in California. And maybe if you could explain a little bit about that, because I found that what you told me to be very disturbing, being a Californian myself.
So I'll give you a personal perspective, I'll give you a community or a Jewish perspective, and I'll give you a business perspective. Personally, I've taken the scenic route. My career took me to Australia, Queensland. I spent a year there working for the Jewish community there. I then spent 3 years in Dublin, in Ireland, working for LinkedIn. 1 year in London, in the UK. A wealthy, rich, very grounded Jewish community. And after all of that, I found myself moving to Texas. I think that says a lot about the gravity of the American South for young, enterprising Jews. And so that's the personal perspective. It was an informed life decision. It wasn't a Jewish decision or a business decision. It was a life decision. If I am taking a Jewish standpoint, I mean, October 7th really rattled everyone in more ways than we can even begin to count. And if I am a CEO of a company and I want to take my family somewhere because we need to be in the US for business purposes, it'll be very hard subjecting my sons and daughters, my husband or wife, to what might happen to them in the bluer states with the more hostile younger population. We have people in the Texas community who moved from the coast to Texas because their kids had suffered from boycotts and walkouts. Their parents have been accused of being a complicit in genocide, etc. And who wants to put their family through that, no matter the business objective? Now, if you do take into consideration the business perspective, and you can see the sign next to me, it says, consider Texas. I believe that if you put Texas side by side with anywhere in the world, more often than not, Texas will win the business case as well for a variety of reasons, which I'm very happy to go into, but I don't think that's the goal for this call.
Well, that's very interesting. The idea that your perspective on where to live in the United States has changed since October 7th is really quite a relevant current issue. Ira.
Yeah, can we see this yet? Or is this?
Yeah, I was going to ask whether or not, Ira, any of this is showing up in the data. Also, I'd love to know your own personal story from a family point of view of how you ended up in Florida. We're not hearing you.
Hello? Yeah. Austin first has about 36,000 Jews today. So it has seen significant increases, okay? There are, by the way, perhaps as many as 330,000 Israelis in the United States today. That's it. There's 7.7 million Jews. There's 330,000 Israelis. And, listening to Tal, I can understand where his decision might be a bit different than perhaps other Jews. But I would point out that there are over 4,000 colleges and universities in the country. And there have been problems at a couple of hundred. And that there are 18.6 million college students in the United States. And a very tiny minority are involved in, strong anti-Israel activity. So
well, are you seeing that in University of Miami as an example?
University of Miami handled everything beautifully. Soon after October 7th, a Muslim student group came forward and said they wanted to hold a rally for peace. And our administration said, great. And the Hillel rabbi, the imam, and one of the ministers got together, put together a service. We've had no problems on the University of Miami campus at all. Like I said, most campuses are not having that kind of a problem. And we can't tell much about the way in which Jews are moving around by what the Israelis are doing, because they're really a tiny percentage. Israeli born, by the way, is well under 100,000. We have other people here who with Israeli passports who also, let's say, came from Russia, went to Israel in 1989 and have since come to the United States. So the Israelis are not a big part of the American population. Personally, when I got my PhD from Ohio State University, you had to go where there were jobs open for people in my field. And that particular year, there happened to be a job for me in South Florida. And part of the reason I applied in South Florida, in addition to right around New York, which is where my whole family was at the time, was due to the fact that I knew that over time, the experience was that Jews from New York, as they age, a large percentage end up here in South Florida. We already had some relatives here. It's called chain migration, right? And that played a major role. And then following me, most of the rest of my family has moved to South Florida. I don't have any relatives left in New York that are close enough to even think about visiting. So,
so obviously, with the concentration of Jews in Florida, I suspect that you don't feel necessarily a sense of anti-Semitism that is there, do you?
Well, we have a governor who doesn't seem to want to could just come out right and say that's wrong when people put swastikas on an overhead thing on the turnpike. Okay. There is some anti-Semitism here. But no, I live in an area that is probably a third Jewish. Okay. And particularly in Southeast Florida, we have 750,000 Jews in the state, not counting snowbirds. Okay, we have 750,000. And the vast majority, 90% of them, live in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County. That's Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Palm Beach. So no, we feel, more than safe here. We haven't really had any serious problems with anti-Semitism here compared to certain other parts of the country.
What about you, Mark? What does it feel
I
like?
just want to follow. Can I just follow up with Ira just for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just because a similar situation. Although my father actually graduated from Miami High School in the 1930s for a medical reason, he had to go down there, but. Right. What I'm seeing is a lot of my the people who the parents moved and then the kids followed. And I assume this may be happening in Atlanta. I was doing one of the things I do in looking at demographics is the kids move, the parents follow. And when the parents move, the kids follow. So I'm in the same situation, except for my brother. My entire family now is basically in Florida. So it's the same situation, and increasingly my wife's family, although the Canadians are staying out of Florida for now.
Well, let's get into this question of what it's like actually living there and feeling your Jewishness and fitting into the community. So, Mark, what is it like in Atlanta?
So, Atlanta is, I think it's a little different than what you experience, Ira. Keeping in mind that east of Atlanta is one of the one of the original home bases of the KKK. In fact, it was that group up in Stone Mountain that decided to Yahoo it down to the city of Atlanta in the early 1950s and blow up the temple. And if you're not familiar with it, Alfred Urey wrote a great book called Driving Miss Daisy, which was a novel, but a historical novel, because Alfred Urey grew up in Atlanta. And so he experienced all of that. And that unfortunately hasn't changed much. We see a lot of incidents of anti-Semitism in high schools, junior high schools. I mean, the Federation was constantly trying to build a secure feeling among the Jewish population and gave money for security forces at temples and schools and other things like that. I don't want to paint a hysterical picture, but it can be very uncomfortable. I will tell you that we practiced shooter drills at Federation once every 2 months. I mean, like schools do, where we went out of the building and tried to be in an organized fashion to practice. It's very uncomfortable when you feel things like that. And I just wanted to just say one more thing, picking up something Tal said. Of course, the political atmosphere and bringing a lot of Israelis and a lot of Jews, to rally around Israel thankfully, after October 7th. In fact, Jewish people, I mean, really first came to the United States for religious persecution reasons. And the first area of settlement was Charleston. In fact, the oldest temple in the United States is in Charleston. And if you're ever in Charleston, you should go there. It's beautiful.
And I think the third one is in Savannah.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and so I was going to say, so Georgia became sort of an early home of the Sephardic Jews that came from Europe, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. It's been growing since, but the real growth in Atlanta is after, say, the 1950s. In the 1950s, we had a Jewish population of 9,600. Today, we're at 130,000. So a lot of that growth, picking up on what Ira said, is migration for reasons of economics and, lifestyle. Atlanta can offer.
But one thing I'd like to, you talk about the anti-Semitism, and the question I have is, has the locus of anti-Semitism changed? In other words, when I was growing up, you always assumed there was a bunch of, basically, rednecks from the South. That was where your problems were. I've just finished an article for City Journal looking at where the greatest concentration of both anti-Semitic and anti-Israel feeling is, and it's not predominantly from whites or from conservatives. It's predominantly from liberals and, sadly, ethnic minorities, particularly African Americans. Has that changed in Atlanta as well? I mean, that's
not that we see it. I mean, as I said, we still have a strong presence. Of course, it's not called KKK, and you don't see them marching around in white robes, but the presence is really felt, and it is mostly traditional groups, white nationalists, and so on and so forth. And it's the temple bombing was one thing, but if you go back into the late 1860s, the Jewish population in the South was very pro-Southern and fought in the Civil War. I have friends whose great-grandparents fought for the Confederacy, and it continued to build. But after the Civil War, when the KKK continued to grow to unprecedented strengths, you had things like the Leo Frank lynching, which again, Alfred Uhry created a great play or musical about it that's now been in Atlanta for about 2 weeks.
So, Tal, the impression I get listening to Ira and Mark is that we have in Florida, New York, Atlanta, kind of older communities that Jews had to fit into. And my impression about Austin is it's a completely different environment. Texas is a completely different environment. It's more cowboy culture, more individualistic.
Well, my friend Ryan Streeter, who's my boss at Civitas, said that Texas is where the builder Jews go.
The builder Jews?
Yeah.
Very good. Well, a builder anything, right?
Right.
Texas strikes me as being very much of a builder, not just even in the physical sense, but also from a tech point of view, building intellectual property. So what's it like? What is the environment like in Austin area and in Texas in general?
But I can describe from experience kind of how it transformed over the last 4 years. When I got here, July 10th, 2021, this is my Texas anniversary.
Yeah.
I celebrate it every year. I go to the Texas chili parlor. It's called the Cloakroom, which is a little dive bar just by the Capitol. When I got here first, and I was looking for friends, basically, I had to scrape, and I came up with 3 or 4 people who were already here. All entrepreneurs, came for different reasons. 2 of them were fed up with Silicon Valley for a variety of reasons, tax and work and recruitment, and one needed a place to park his money after a very significant business exit. And he said, yeah, everyone told me I should be in Texas. I'm like, oh, so you know people here? He goes, no, sorry, not friends. My accountant told me I should be in Texas. So they came for those reasons. Some were pushed here, some were pulled here. And that was 4 years ago. Today, there isn't a day where I don't get a WhatsApp or an email or a LinkedIn tag with someone saying, hi, I'm new to Texas or I'm new to Austin. I heard about you. I heard about the Chamber of Commerce. How do I get involved? It's either that or someone who's considering coming over and wants to ask some questions. There isn't a day that goes by without it, which is remarkable. If 4 years ago, we had to buy voodoo donuts, which is traditional donuts, and asked for plain ones for Hanukkah, today I can count 4 or 5 different Jewish bakeries and bakers who are working here and will deliver whatever kind of babka you want to your doorstep. So we're seeing a renaissance, we're seeing a flow, and if I had to characterize the population that migrates here, from Israel, it'll be tech entrepreneurs who need to set up a location in the US, and they choose Texas because they identified for the business benefit, but also because there's enough ground roots community that's already here. Domestically, whether you're Jewish or Israeli, it could be a senior intercompany transfer. They've set up a site in Austin and you're there. It could be some COVID refugees that wanted a place that had a bit more freedoms throughout the pandemic and they fell in love and stayed here. And now, and I'll close with this, we're also seeing people from outside of the tech ecosystem that's coming over. So not just organization where they can sponsor you and relocate you, but also traditional businesses in the services industry, in some hospitality. So it becomes much richer, much more robust. But I think the two common denominators are business-oriented and also want to have a flavor of Jewish and Israeli life safely and securely.
And this is very interesting because there's this notion of critical mass. And Ira was saying earlier that if you look at the number of Israelis that are coming over versus Jews that are migrating, who have been here for a while, migrating from someplace else, it's a smaller number. Are you finding that you're developed? Would you consider the fact that there is a critical mass of Jews, both Israeli Jews and Jews that are migrating from other parts of the country, that are happening in Austin, or is it still in the formative stages?
So 2 things. One, in a response to Ira, I remember when I was backpacking after my military service, you'd ask people, they probably haven't met an Israeli up until that point in their life. We were talking early 2000s. And they're like, wow, I'm like, Israel, like such an enormous country. Everywhere I go, there are Israelis. And then you confront with the reality, there's only 7 billion of us. But they're like, no, that can't be. I've seen Israelis everywhere I travel. So I think,
if you have multiple personalities, you can increase the number.
So I think despite our small numbers, we find ourselves in many critical junctions, and we make people know that we're Israelis. It's very hard to hide. With regards to the type of Jewish connection that is forming here, I would say we're very much on the ground level still. And that's not taking anything away from the people who have lived their entire lives here and have built a wonderful Jewish community center up north, that have businesses that have been donating heavily before October 7th, but surely since. I think we're seeing a resurgence, and part of our challenges and areas of focus is how do we bring those communities together? The grassroots Texas Jewish community that is not just in Austin, it's actually much more integrated in Austin, Houston, and in Dallas than it is here, even in San Antonio. So the existing community, and then the new transplants, the Israelis, and also the Jewish migration from the coast that are coming in.
I'd love to ask Ira about the state of the California Jewish community. We experience it. This is entirely self-referencing here, so forgive me. This is not data. This is just opinion. But
he has data.
But I'd love to hear your data about it. In the Los Angeles area, we see kind of 2 counter movements. One is we see a strengthening of the traditional from community in West Los Angeles.
Like Pico Robertson, those areas. Yeah.
And we're seeing, a greater incidence of Orthodox and Hasidic Jews, big migration of Israeli Jews. But Los Angeles is very much of a suburban area. It's not like, it doesn't have the center of downtown like New York does or something like that. We're seeing kind of a desecularization, with the exception maybe of Chabad in some areas, but kind of a weakening identity. I know, like the Orange County Jewish Federation is very concerned about the intermarriage rates, about the weakening culture of Jews here. And I wanted to know what Ira sees about that.
And just one last thing, because something we may be doing here is also the problem of getting younger Jewish families, because the cost of housing is so high that, so what we have is we have many, if I go to my synagogue, which is the oldest one in Orange County, almost everybody at the table will have kids who've moved somewhere else. Right. Is that showing up in the numbers, Ira?
We're not hearing you, Ira.
We're
not hearing you.
Yeah, now we are.
Why? Okay. First, in California, there are about 1.3 million Jews, about 850,000 of whom live in the Los Angeles area. And for San Francisco, you have about another 300,000. And I suspect what's going on in California, and we do have recent studies that support this, is what's happening in the Jewish community around the country. Okay. Because being Jewish is both a religion as well as an ethnicity. Okay. People choose to associate with being Jewish in different ways. And from people who are Jewish because they're strongly Zionist to people who are ultra Orthodox. What we have going on, though, is kind of a polarization, just as it is in American politics. We do have a strong movement of people who are becoming, quote unquote, more Jewish. And we have a large group of people as well who are, they'll identify as Jewish. They may show up at a Seder once a year or light Hanukkah candles, or simply express their Judaism through the Democratic Party. I call it a tikkun olam with a menorah. Okay. And then there are people who are simply Zionists, and you have two growing poles here. One pole is becoming more and more religious and more Orthodox and more into it, and another group of people are kind of just barely hanging on. They are just Jewish, and that's what's going on in California as well.
So if I could just
Atlanta,
well, I was going to just pile on to what Ira was saying. I think the issue of Judaism and how you incorporate Judaism in your life is an ongoing issue all around the country. It is in Atlanta. So in Atlanta, as I mentioned, 130,000 Jewish people, not even 30% know or understand what the Federation does or is. Right. So there is sort of what is the Federation is supposed to be the centralization of thinking and doing in the Jewish community, and it's not really well known enough in order to do that. Adding to the fact that, and I understand that, financial issues are always difficult, but the Jewish Federation of Atlanta was very transactional. Everything it did was based on how much money did we raise today? Nary as much thinking into how are they going to get these kids who think or are not sure whether Israel is in the right in defending the country against Hamas. So in Atlanta, I can speak from this, you have an older Jewish population that's much, much more conservative. When I say conservative, I don't mean in Jewish religious manner. I'm talking about in politics and economically speaking. So, and then you have a younger part of it that, is not sure what this is, how this is going to work. And of course, there's mixed marriages that, that further take away from the Jewish religion. I'll just add this one thing. So I am part of a mixed marriage. My wife, Maureen, is Catholic. And our temple, which is a very reformed temple, when we were going through bar mitzvah training, every Friday night at services, the rabbi would ask non-Jewish spouses to stand up. And he thanked them for supporting the temple, supporting the Jewish cultural life, and so forth. I thought that was magnanimous, and we needed to see more of that. Anyway, it's a problem.
But I wonder in some ways whether or not part of the problem may also be that that Jews obviously have had historic ties to certain parts of the country. Those are now being broken. So will a Jewish community that, let's say, in 20 years is maybe 30, 40% in the South and maybe spread around it, will it have a different character than our sort of, the Irving Howe, World of Our Fathers?
Yearning for a good bagel.
Right. I mean,
right.
In other words, are we looking at a very different thing? Like I even see with my younger daughter, who's definitely the most Jewish in the family, and speaks Hebrew, and and goes to Chabad sometimes as well. I see a very different kind of Judaism from her than I would have seen from what Marshall and I both growing up in New York with the descendants of the early immigrants. Do you think there'll be a different character to Judaism as it becomes less New York centric and more Southern?
I think so. I think we see it in Atlanta quite a bit, and we have a strong Chabad community here. And I would agree with you, Joel, that it is resonating with a younger audience. I think more because it's kind of intimate, so they're not big sprawling congregations. And generally speaking, the Chabad rabbis seem to be more open and willing to embrace thinking of young people and not try to force different, Jewish thought on their congregations. So I'm hopeful that it works. We have a lot of Jewish schools here in Atlanta that are working hard and got some very big donations from the wealthier people in our Jewish community. So I'm hopeful that that'll continue to grow.
Well, this Chabad issue is definitely something we want to explore a little bit further. I agree with you, Mark. I think what I'm seeing with the Chabad, at least in the suburban area of LA where we live, is very much of a focus on social cohesion, on Shabbat dinners.
Yeah, and like for the students
as opposed to ritual.
That's exactly the point, Mark. That's what I was saying. It's
less now, and Tal,
and more community.
So you're how does Chabad play in Austin?
I think young Jews and older Jews now, everyone has a Chabad story to tell. Everyone has a Chabad story to tell, which is remarkable. I mean, you could have forgotten your Jewish sense of bar mitzvah, but you still have a Chabad story to tell. From traveling, from getting stuck, from meeting someone, which is remarkable. Specifically to Austin, we're seeing something very special now. We have two members of the community. One is the Chabad Rabbi, Mendy Levertov, Rabbi Levertov, and another enterprising Jewish here, more established, also who left California to come to Austin. And they're setting up a new building, speaking of Wilder Jews. So a new building for the Chabad house. It's going to be called, temporary name, the Chai House. And just the design itself looks closer to a Soho house than it would to a Chabad house. So it's not only around the foldable plastic chairs and the Friday dinner, and it's also about a place for people to have, they call it a third space. So another place for the community to be around. I can book it, I can have a talk there, I can have a session there, I can use a conference room. So I think Chabad understands that Judaism as a product needs to service other areas or cater to other areas of our identity. And if it's only left on the Jewish bookshelf or in the synagogue, for many of the younger Jews, being Jewish becomes a liability. They get the hate, they get the resentment, they get the stigma way before they can enjoy the benefits. And that's something that's slowly being recognized by institutions all over the country.
Younger Jews in Miami are totally different. Younger Jews in Miami are less likely to be intermarried than older Jews.
Wow, that's
Younger
interesting.
Jews in Miami are more likely to be going to Chabad than older Jews. Younger Jews in Miami are more likely to be very attached to Israel than older Jews. We have exactly the opposite
interesting.
situation here.
That's very
Yes.
interesting. Wow.
And in the last survey that I did in Miami-Dade County, Jews under the age of 35, almost half had participated in something at Chabad in the past year.
Wow.
Almost half.
And how are you seeing those trends? That's really interesting, Ira. How are you seeing those trends play out nationally in terms of Chabad participation?
Oh, Chabad has a large, if you look at the last Pew survey, okay, I don't want to cite the number because right now I can't remember it, okay, but a large percentage of American Jews are now participating with Chabad. It could be anything from just going to a menorah lighting to being there every week. But Chabad has become a mainstream operation. They now raise more money than the Jewish Federations of North America.
Wow.
Here in Miami, you go back 30 years and we had 5 Chabad operations. I think we're close to 30 Chabad operations now. And Chabad recognized, for example, the growth of the Jewish population in downtown Miami, which tripled between 2004 and 2014 and has continued to grow today. And they put a multi-million-dollar facility right in what we call the Brickell area, okay? And Chabad is drawing people left and right. They don't have dues. That's part of it.
Right.
And they're very welcoming. And
Go
they're
ahead, Tal.
on
Tal, you were
hundreds
going to
of
say something.
campuses. Go ahead, Tal.
I was in Miami a couple of times last month. Friends took me before. I'm an expecting father, so they took me for one last hurrah, and we stayed at the least Jewish hotel I've ever been to in my entire life. Let's just say that. And there's a stone throw away. There was a restaurant called Motek, playing music that I would never imagine I would hear outside of Israel, let alone on a beach in Miami. And so many staffers in the hotel had either a Chai or an Israel map. I found myself saying more Shabbat Shalom in Miami than I would in Ra'anana in Israel.
You know, one of the issues that I hear from kind of the Jewish establishment, especially on campus here within Chapman University, the pushback historically on Chabad is the separation of men and women. And the traditional view that the sexes should not mix. How are younger people overcoming that intellectually and psychologically? I would have thought that given kind of the free range of today's society, of today's youth, that would be something that they would not be able to get over. How are they dealing with that?
I can say for personal experience, while Ira's mic is being turned on, that I mean, if you force a modern secular Jew to choose between his what they see everywhere else at work, online, which is men and women are equal, we should have the same opportunity to do the same thing, and an expression of the Jewish identity, which is we're separated, we have different roles. It's a hard choice to make, and it's a nudge out of the religion rather than a way to bring them in. I think is that do well cater to the sign of the times, if you will, and find a way to reconcile those contradictions.
I'm picking up on what Tal said. So the Buckhead Chabad, which right literally in walking distance from where we live, it is organized by a young rabbi. And while he will not shake hands with the women walking in to his home, he's not demanding that couples be separated or kids in different genders. So, and I think to Tal's point, in order to be successful, and particularly, there are a lot of secular Jews, at least in Atlanta, that would be more welcomed, or they would be more interested in a kind of a Jewish entity that accepts kind of modern beliefs in what Judaism can represent, I think.
Well, just as we get towards the close here, I'd like to get each of your views on what do you think the impact of Jews moving to the South will be in the long term on the Jewish identity in the United States, which again historically is very much tied to the Lower East Side and maybe to some extent to Hollywood. How does the Southernization of the Jews change who Jews are and how we will be regarded in the country? Anyone wants to start?
Well, I'll just say this, we did at Federation, I launched two surveys, one demographically oriented and the other more community involvement oriented. And in the demographic audit, we found that 64% of the Jewish population been in Atlanta for less than a year.
Wow.
So I think that the good part of this is that this is parents moving to Atlanta to be with their children and their grandchildren, and also younger couples or younger Jewish kids moving to Atlanta to be where their parents are. And so this is all good for us. I mean, we continue to see growth in the Jewish community here, and I think it will continue along that path. Hopefully it will.
Ira?
Ira, you want to give us your opinion?
Sure, yeah, but I have to take issue with something that Mark said. Mark, there's a difference between a survey that's done, as was done in Atlanta. I did one, and Jack Euclides did one after me, with a random sample and one without a random sample. Having done 53 local Jewish community studies, it is absolutely impossible that 64% of Jews in Atlanta moved in the past year. 64% of your sample did, but unless you spent about $500,000 today, you did not get a random sample. And so the 64% can't be correct.
Well, I will take a little bit of issue. The reason we got a large sample size, I can't remember exactly. And we did it because we announced the survey and the link to the survey in the Federation's newsletter that goes out every week. So we got a very big response to it.
Mark biases it.
But
okay, there's no way.
This is what I love about Jews. We have such a great Talmudic discussion here.
That part I won't disagree with.
But in the long
those
run,
numbers are usually around 5 to 10%. Okay, so 64% can't be close to right. If it was toward the high side in Atlanta, I could buy it, but it can't be right. Miami, South Florida is one of the few places in the United States where we look north to find the South. This place is a suburb of Havana and an exurb of New York. When Jews move here, they do not really leave the New York metropolitan area. Their neighbors are mostly from the Northeast and from the Midwest. Okay. And when we're talking about the South, if you want to look at places like Montgomery, Alabama, they do have a problem with what I call a threshold number of customers. If you only have 5,000 Jews in town, you are really kind of limited as to what your community can possibly offer. And if that number is declining, you're going to lose your Jewish newspaper. The JCC is going to have to scale back. Synagogues are going to close. That's different from the experience that Mark is talking about in Atlanta, or I'm talking about in Miami, where we do have growing Jewish populations, we have significant numbers, and we can afford to offer the types of services that Jews are used to and the types of programs that Jews are used to in the Northeast and in California. Okay.
So Tal, let's end it with you, because in many respects you're the great frontier for Judaism and for the migration of Jewish people. So what would you like to say as far as the future Jewish identity in Texas?
So the first month after October 7th, we were scrambling, we were organizing galas, we were donating. Some of the wealthiest people of the community were donating a lifetime of tzedakah, of charity, in just a few weeks, and everyone was tapping out. At some point, me and my business partner, we realized that we need a different vehicle because we can't donate ourselves out of this current situation. And we started a fund, a venture fund, a for-profit organization that's aimed to invest in Israeli and Jewish-led defense technology startup and help them scale in the US. We figured it'll help us do a few things: protect the West, support the Israeli economy, and funnel resources to the people who can make use of them, something in a more regenerative way. To our surprise, we had a lukewarm reception from the Jewish community at large. A lot of them had already donated as much as they could. They had nothing left to give. Some of them said, look, if it's Israel related, it's charity, it's not for profit, it's not an investment. I don't want to confuse those two buckets, right? And when we saw that reception, and we went to our other allies, Christian living in the South, traditional industries, oil and gas money, doctors, etc. And to our surprise, they immediately referred to the Judeo-Christian values and got on board. They were our biggest donors and some of our biggest, and to this date, they've been some of our most involved collaborators. So all this to say that some of the opportunity here is in really fortifying and strengthening alliances that were dormant for years, but now they feel they've been called to arms to protect the Jews, to protect Israel, and they've been incredibly helpful to us. We hope we'll have a chance to reciprocate and support them in that way, but it makes me very optimistic because it adds another element, another dimension to the Jewish cause.
Joel, any final thoughts?
No, I think this is fascinating, and I think it's, I won't be around to see it probably, but I think we're looking at a major shift in the character and the future of the Jewish community in the United States, just as much as when people started moving to California in the early part of the last century. We're in the midst of a transition, and from what all of you are saying, there's some very hopeful elements.
Gentlemen, this has been just a fascinating conversation. Thank you for spending time with us. We appreciate it. And we look forward to having you follow up with us on the Feudal Future podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity, guys. Great to meet everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Feudal Future.